A photograph from Philadelphia shows a narrow stone tower rising behind a 19th century building. Then the same shape appears again in Paris, and that coincidence starts to look impossible. At first glance, it looks like coincidence, but the tower's proportions, windows, and stonework match too closely to dismiss as chance. The question is simple, but unsettling. Why would the same tower appear in cities that never shared a design office, a builder, or a blueprint? Between 1840 and 1910, towers like this appeared across North America, Central Europe, and deep into Russia. Officially, they were water pressure towers. That explanation sounds clean, technical, and complete until you look at the architecture. A tower meant only for pipes does not need copper domes, carved stone panels, or tall arched windows placed with ceremonial precision. Yet those details repeat from city to city, as if the same hand drew them over and over again in different countries. In Philadelphia, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, and Kazan, the same profile keeps returning like a signature nobody was meant to notice, and the paperwork is strangely thin. For such expensive, visible structures, the surviving records are almost non-existent. No drawings, no contracts, no clear project files. It is as if someone carefully avoided leaving a trail. That absence matters because ordinary city towers were documented obsessively. These ones were not. In St. Matters, Louis Sanborn Fire Maps list 14 brick towers with a note, purpose unknown. Then, on the next map, they are gone. The phrase purpose unknown appears more often than it should in 19th century records. Here, it feels less like uncertainty and more like refusal. Then the photographs change the pattern. In city after city, the towers sat behind famous buildings, at street corners, and in forgotten blocks. They were not the subject of the image, but they were always there, standing with the same silent precision. After 1895, the towers begin to thin out. By the 1910s, most of them have vanished from the cityscape. A camera does not erase a tower. If the image changed, then the city itself changed first. That raises the harder question: why were so many cities losing the same kind of structure at roughly the same time? In some Midwestern digs, workers uncovered stone foundations that did not fit the first settlement layers. The masonry looked older, tighter, and stranger. One Indianapolis excavation reportedly found a circular stone base about 40 feet wide. The official file called it anomalous, and then the trail stopped. No follow-up study. No public debate. The report was closed in a way that feels far too familiar. Then came the most disturbing possibility. Maybe some towers were never built in the 1800s at all. Maybe cities inherited them. A 2019 survey of 43 towers in the northeast found that 31 faced almost exactly east, aligned with the sunrise on the equinox. That is not random. It suggests design, intent, and a rule hidden inside the architecture itself. If these towers were real, then the question is not where they came from. It is why so many cities decided to make them disappear. In a 19th century city photograph, the tower rises behind the rooftops like it belongs to a different map. Its position is precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Not every example was grand. Some were tucked into industrial blocks, plicked by warehouses, or hidden behind train lines, as if the city itself tried to bury them. That is what makes the pattern so disturbing. These towers were not random decorations. They were placed like markers repeating across districts that never met each other. City plans from the same era often label them with vague names, then move on. The tower is recorded, but its purpose is never really explained. Then the records start to thin out. Not the towers themselves, but the paperwork around them. As if the administrative trail was deliberately cut short. In one city after another, the demolition arrives later than expected. The tower survives 1 decade, then vanishes in the next, and almost nobody asks why. That timing matters. It suggests removal, not decay. A city deciding that a structure should disappear before it can be studied too closely. And here is the strange part. The towers were often expensive, ornate, and carefully built, yet the surviving paperwork treats them like afterthoughts. If a structure is truly essential, cities preserve its story. They rename it, repair it, defend it. These towers were treated like something more inconvenient than important. Instead, the language around them becomes evasive. unknown purpose, old structure, scheduled removal. Those phrases repeat until they stop sounding accidental. Look at the photographs closely enough, and the towers stop feeling decorative. They become anchors in the composition, as if the camera was told to include them. That is where orientation becomes interesting. Several surviving examples appear aligned with remarkable precision, suggesting the builders cared about direction, not just height. Some alignments point toward sunrise, others toward the geometry of the surrounding streets. Either way, the placement looks planned long before the city map was finalized. So what were these towers actually meant to mark? A single tower can be dismissed, dozens cannot. When the same structure appears in the same period across distant cities, coincidence starts to collapse. Then there is the problem of disappearance. By the early 20th century, many towers are simply gone, without the dramatic evidence that usually follows demolition. No rubble field, no public outrage, just a vacant space where a heavy stone object should have left a scar on the neighborhood forever. That silence is the clue. When a city removes something useful, it explains itself. When it removes something unusual, it often erases the conversation too. Some researchers began noticing that the remaining towers shared more than style. Their proportions, openings, and internal levels hinted at a function beyond storage or display. Those features raise an uncomfortable possibility. These structures may have been adapted, not invented, by the cities that claimed them. Reuse can hide a much older origin. Then the records become even harder to trust. In some places, the tower is listed in one decade and absent in the next, with no matching explanation in between. That is the hallmark of a controlled loss. Not destruction in a single moment, but a steady removal from paper, memory, and eventually the skyline itself. At some point, the question stops being whether the towers existed. The real question becomes how a global pattern can be hidden in plain sight for so long. If the pattern is real, then the disappearance was not local. It was coordinated across borders, across administrations, and across generations of record keepers. And that is why the empty plots matter more than the surviving towers. They are not gaps in a city, they are evidence that something was deliberately taken away. Once you notice those absences, the skyline changes forever. The next question is whether the towers were only one piece of a much larger hidden system. The first clue was not a tower in a skyline, but a tower in a forgotten municipal photograph. It rose beside a brick station like it belonged to another age. City directories did not explain it. They listed the building, then skipped the tower entirely, as if the shaft had no purpose worth naming. Yet on insurance maps, the same shape kept returning, not as an ornament, but as a marked feature that surveyors thought important enough to note. The deeper I looked, the stranger the silence became. Whole blocks changed, but the tower entries vanished without a trace of demolition or replacement. Then I found them in factory districts, standing near rail lines and waterworks, always close to infrastructure, yet never described with any real certainty. That mattered, because the official story kept calling them utility structures. But the photographs showed facades, capped roofs, and masonry work far beyond necessity. In one Midwestern city, a tower appeared in a street survey beside a church and a depot. 10 years later, the same lot was simply empty. No foundation report, no wrecking notice, no follow-up article. Just a clean absence, like someone erased the building before history could ask why. Then came the construction permits from the 1890s, repeated renovations, sudden purchases, and a strange number of delays clustered around the same addresses. Those delays mattered because they often came before disappearance. A tower would be listed, altered, or inspected, and then the trail would simply go cold. In some cities, the towers were rebuilt once, then omitted the next time. That pattern suggests a decision, not an accident, and decisions leave fingerprints. And the architecture itself kept repeating. Narrow openings, nearly ceremonial vertical lines and roof forms that made the towers feel older than the streets around them. A few surviving plans hinted at upper chambers and internal shafts, but not the kind that merely moved water. The drawings suggested a more complex circulation. That is where the story gets uncomfortable. If a tower has hidden levels, then the question is not just what it was, but what it connected to. Some researchers noticed a strange habit. Towers tended to stand near rail junctions, reservoirs, and older civic corridors, as if they belonged to a network. And once that network idea appears, the map stops looking random. Separate towers begin to read like nodes, placed where a wider system could breathe. Then came the orientation studies. A surprising number of surviving towers lined up with celestial directions, not just streets, and that changed the scale of the question. If builders cared about sunlight and geometry, then the towers were not passive. They were aligned, measured, and possibly intended to interact with the sky itself. A few notes from the period even mention upper windows that were unusually high for ordinary maintenance. They made sense only if something was expected from above. That detail matters because it breaks the utility explanation. Utility structures are designed for function first, not for symbolic height and exact placement. And still, after all that, the record goes quiet. No master catalogue, no unified explanation, only scattered references and local stories that do not fully fit. That silence is not proof of nothing. Sometimes the absence of records tells you more than a shelf full of official explanations ever could. By now the pattern is hard to ignore. Towers appeared across continents, matched by form, then vanished in a coordinated historical blur. If that pattern was deliberate, then the towers were never just architecture. They were part of a language we can still see, even if we cannot yet read it. And once you accept that, every empty lot becomes suspicious. The real question is not where the towers went, but what was built over the silence. The first missing tower did not vanish in a fire. It disappeared after the lot was cleared, the stones hauled away, and the address quietly renumbered. That kind of disappearance matters because cities rarely erase a landmark without first deciding it has become inconvenient. The paperwork usually tells the story before the wrecking ball does. In several cities, the problem was never what was torn down. It was what replaced the tower after the official record stopped asking questions. Because when the tower went down, the surrounding block often changed shape with it. Streets bent differently, fences moved, and the old footprint dissolved into ordinary pavement. That is why the old maps matter so much. They preserve outlines that later city plans prefer not to mention, and those outlines keep pointing back to one structure. The tower was not always labelled a tower. In some records it appears as a tank house, a ventilator, or simply an elevated brick structure with no further explanation, and yet the architecture stayed stubbornly consistent. The same tapering profile, the same narrow openings, the same deliberate vertical lift appeared from one city to another. So the question changed. It was no longer whether cities built towers, but why so many of them followed the same hidden template. Some of the best clues came from insurance atlases, because those maps recorded what planners later ignored. A tower could disappear from memory, but not from a fire sheet. One surveyor in Chicago noted a brick tower standing alone on a lot later marked vacant. By the next edition, the tower was gone, but the lot boundaries had not changed. That means the removal was not always about land. Sometimes it was about removing a visible reference point from the city's own memory. And when you remove a reference point, you also remove the questions people ask in front of it. That is how history gets quieter without ever admitting it was edited. A similar pattern appears in Boston and Newark. The towers are first catalogued, then repurposed, and finally omitted, as if they had always been marginal. But marginal things do not usually get built with expensive brick, carved details, and formal symmetry. Those are the choices of something intended to be seen. That is where the utility explanation starts to wobble. The ornament was not an accident tacked on afterward. In many cases it seems to have been part of the original design. Then come the strange alignments. Some towers sit on axes that make more sense if they were meant to catch light than if they were meant to pump water. At that point, the official vocabulary stops helping. A structure can be called a water tower, but a pattern that repeats across continents begins to look like doctrine. One researcher in Eastern Europe found repeated references to demolition during redevelopment, but not to the tower's purpose before demolition. The before story had been stripped away, and that absence is a real evidence. Buildings can be lost, but purpose usually leaves a trail unless someone deliberately breaks the chain. When the chain breaks in the same way, city after city, the simplest explanation starts to look less simple. The towers were not erased by chance. They were curated out of view. That is the part people miss. The demolition was only the final act. The first act was redefining what the tower meant until no one defended it. In other words, the tower had to become ordinary before it could become disposable. Once it was ordinary, nobody asked where it came from, or why it had looked so different. That silence is exactly what makes the surviving photographs so powerful. They show a city before it finished editing itself. If you keep following those photographs, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. The towers were widespread, deliberate, and later treated as if they had never mattered. And that leaves one last possibility hanging over every empty lot. Maybe the towers were not removed because they were useless, but because whatever they marked was not meant to survive. In the last surviving city records, one tower keeps appearing where no tower should remain. The empty lot is newer than the loss, and that is what makes it feel deliberate, because once you compare photographs across decades, the pattern sharpens. The tower is there, then gone, and the street around it has been quietly rebuilt to look ordinary. The official explanation still reaches for utility, but utility does not explain why the same silhouettes kept returning in different cities, with the same proportions and the same restraint. By the time researchers plotted the locations, the map looked less like coincidence and more like a network. Philadelphia, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, Kazan, all repeating the same architectural answer, and then the records thinned out. For structures this prominent, the paper trail should have been thick. Instead, there are gaps, missing permits, and files that end before they begin. That is what makes the silence suspicious. Not destruction alone, but documentation that seems to stop exactly when the towers become hardest to explain. Some cities even hid them in plain sight. A tower might sit behind a courthouse, beside a warehouse, or at the edge of a parade ground, as if it belonged to another system entirely, and yet the removal rarely left a public argument behind. In many places, the tower simply vanished from the skyline, then from the map, then from memory. That pattern is harder to dismiss when the same architecture appears in places that never shared a single planning office. Different governments, different languages, same disappearing act. Then came the orientation studies. A researcher measured dozens of towers and found that many faced east with unnerving precision, as if they were built to meet a specific rising point. That kind of alignment is not how you build a random water structure. It is how you point a structure towards something you already expect to arrive. So the question changes. If these were not ordinary service buildings, then what kind of urban function needed that kind of geometry, that kind of attention, that kind of placement? Maybe that is why the best evidence hides in plain photographs. The towers are never the subject, but they keep standing behind the real scene, like witnesses no one wanted. And when a witness keeps appearing in every city, the easy answer stops feeling safe. Either the towers meant something shared, or every city copied a secret it later denied. The removal campaign becomes the next clue. Across continents, the same decades keep surfacing, and the towers begin disappearing in a narrow historical window that looks planned. That window matters because coordinated removal implies coordination at the top. Somebody had to decide not only that the tower should go, but that their traces should soften with them. And once you accept that, the towers no longer look like decorative oddities. They look like markers of a system that was retired before the public was ever told what it did. That is the hardest part to say out loud. If the towers were once useful, then their usefulness was probably tied to a buried infrastructure, not a quaint municipal fad. And if that infrastructure existed, then the removals were not cleanup. They were erasure, the kind that happens when a city no longer wants to remember what it was built over. Even the empty lots feel different when you think that way. They are not empty because nothing stood there. They are empty because something was deliberately removed from the story. What remains is a contradiction. We have the photographs, the maps, the alignments, and the demolition gaps, but the explanation was simplified until the mystery could survive the simplification. I keep returning to the same unsettling possibility. These towers may have marked a function, a boundary, or a technology we can no longer read with the language we have now. And if that is true, then the question is no longer why they were built. The real question is what else was built in that same era, hidden in plain sight, and why so many records seem to stop just when the scale becomes impossible to explain. The towers are gone, but their absence is still arranged with precision. That is why the empty spaces matter now more than the stone ever did, because disappearance can be as deliberate as construction. Because once a city learns how to erase a tower, it also learns how to erase the story around it, and maybe even the skyline that replaced it. So the real mystery is not just what vanished, but what kind of world had to be built to make people stop asking. And if that question leads somewhere deeper, what would we find waiting beneath the official history?